Welcome to another edition of Why Wasn't It Better? I'm Patrick Darms.
And I am Anton Paras, and here we are on this very special edition of Why Wasn't It Better?
It is a special edition, you're right. Just a reminder, this is the podcast where we discuss hyped up, somewhat disappointing films. We'll introduce the film, we'll tell you why it was chosen for the podcast, we'll tell you how it got made, and then we'll provide a bunch of reasons that answer the question, why wasn't it better? And this is definitely special, Anton, because we're here to talk about our very first James Bond movie, our very first foray
Boom,
into the
put it on the
wonderful
board. Put it
world.
on the board. We got a Bond film.
Yeah, James Bond 007. I've hinted at this on our previous recordings, but James Bond has a very special place in my heart. It is by far my favorite film series. I have an almost unhealthy relationship with James Bond to the point where he's influenced my wardrobe. And
Which is
before you
great.
say that's weird, that's a good response because if anyone ever tells you that's weird, that means they just don't dress well as you.
That's I think if we were going to look at a few things to take away from the Bond franchise, the man knows how to dress well and knows how to find a nice car to drive.
He really does. Even when it's Roger Moore wearing flared trousers, the cut of his suit was still perfect.
Uh oh, listeners, aren't you just excited? And uh, with that, Patrick, with this momentous occasion, I think it's important to really dive into the film synopsis. Would you like to walk the listeners through it?
Yes, yes, I sure would. So, we're talking today about Quantum of Solace. Following the death of Vesper Lind, James Bond makes his next mission personal. The hunt for those who blackmailed his lover leads him to ruthless businessman Dominic Green, a key player in the organization which coerced Vesper. Bond learns that Green is plotting to gain total control of a vital natural resource, and he must navigate a minefield of danger and treachery to foil the plan. Quantum of Solace was released on November 14th, 2008 by Eon Productions, directed by Mark Forster, screenplay by Paul Haggis, Neil Purvis, and Robert Wade. I have an asterisk on this. More on this later. Starring Daniel Craig, Olga Kurilenko, Matthew Almeric, Giancarlo Giannini, Jeffrey Wright, and Judi Dench. Budget of $230 million, and it made $589 million at the box office. So a big moneymaker.
Bond's always a
So
moneymaker. I just wanted to add
usually,
their respect.
usually,
I wanted to say respect to Dame Judi Dench, um, all time great. But
it was a
also, yeah,
masterstroke casting decision to
yeah.
cast her as M back in Goldeneye.
Oh yeah. I do think before we even go into why this movie was chosen, I just want to say this really was a film that made a lot of different decisions in the direction with Bond. Sometimes sometimes consciously, and sometimes it was out of a lot of people's hands on the direction it went. But really, this is an interesting film.
Indeed. So I talked about a little bit why I love Bond so much. But talking about why I chose this movie, Anton, where are you on your Bond journey? Like, what's your relationship with James Bond like?
I would say that I'm definitely a big Bond fan. I think that I always get excited for the next one that's coming. Being able to look back on just what James Bond has brought over the years is just it's immeasurable. It's great music attached. We can always tell what are the highlights of a Bond film. It's always just a great time, or it should always be a great time. Sometimes a great time can always change depending on the film that you see, but a few of the most iconic films of our generation, past generations, you can always look at a Bond film to be one of those stacked up amongst those films. So definitely huge respect for the franchise, and I know that this was the second in second in the Daniel Craig era.
It was. It's the 22nd film in the franchise. It was the follow up to Casino Royale, and Casino Royale is one of the most celebrated and beloved films in the series. Quantum of Solace was a direct sequel to Casino Royale. So it was Daniel Craig's sophomore effort as Bond. There was a ton of hype for this. It's a natural choice for this podcast. When he was originally selected to replace Pierce Brosnan, and this would have been announced in 2005, Daniel Craig was a bit of a controversial choice at first for some people. But after the abomination that was Die Another Day, a movie we will eventually be covering,
Right.
I was all in for a new Bond. I was very excited. I felt very much left in the wilderness after Die Another Day.
Oh
So
yeah.
the idea that they were going to start with a clean slate and reboot the franchise, I found that very intriguing. Casino Royale was an instantaneous success for the franchise. Daniel Craig ushered in a serious, gritty, realistic, human James Bond that was embraced by pretty much the entire franchise. Both he and his debut movie completely revitalized the series. Now, when I first heard that we were going to get a direct sequel and it was coming out 2 years later with a 2008, release date, I was ecstatic.
As was
I'm
I.
like, this
Great
is
news,
great.
right?
100%. Because Quantum of Solace being a direct sequel, that's a first for the franchise. So, like I said, the 22nd movie, but they had never really done a direct sequel before. The rest of the movies had very loose continuity, like, especially during the Connery era in the 60s. There was pretty loose continuity between those movies. Each one that came after, they would make subtle references to a previous movie, but you could always watch them out of order. It didn't really matter. So this idea of a direct sequel was brand new. It was a noticeable change. This movie, of course, begins literal minutes after Casino Royale ends. And Quantum of Solace, it made plenty of money, but it was immediately seen as being inferior to its predecessor. And people call it, the classic sophomore slump for Daniel Craig. I think over the years, this is 15 years later, its reputation, I would say, has somewhat recovered. But as someone who is very, I don't want to say active, but I'm very tapped into the Bond community. I'm very much I'm a lurker on the Bond subreddits and a couple other forums. This is still one of the most polarizing films in the
Yeah.
series. People tend to either love it or hate it.
That's a no question there. It's you don't find it very often on people's Mount Rushmore of Bond films.
No, it certainly has its fans, but most people that you will talk to would put it on the lower half.
Yeah.
Now, just for the listeners, we're certainly going to cover plenty of other Bond movies on this podcast. And this doesn't just apply to Bond movies, but I think as we move through, like there's a bunch of MCU movies we're going to talk about. I think it makes sense to cover them in release order. But I wanted to begin with the Craig era specifically for Bond, not just because of recency, but because of the fact that it was a reboot, or at least Casino Royale was a reboot, and this was a direct continuation of that. Now, we're recording these episodes out of order, but if you remember, Anton, Planet of the Apes, which was our first movie, had a connection to Dark Knight Rises, which was our second movie, and we talked about the possibility of maintaining some sort of 6 degrees of separation for these movies. Well,
Right.
the movie prior to this, which will be Tron Legacy, we haven't recorded that yet. There is no direct connection here, but Olivia Wilde did star in Cowboys and Aliens with Daniel Craig, who is obviously the star in this movie. So we have that.
Good connection there. Cowboys and aliens.
Yeah,
Uh
it's not much, but I just wanted to try to keep that flame going for us. Do you want to talk about the production history?
I would love to. Well, to start us off, let's go into some brief background. The James Bond film series has been owned and operated by Eon Productions since its debut in 1962. 1962. Eon, which stands for Everything or Nothing, is today completely owned by producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. Barbara is the daughter of Albert Cubby Broccoli. Wilson is his adopted stepson, thus making Bond unique in the fact that it remains the only major franchise that is family owned. And we will explore the history of Bond and Eon on future episodes. I remember, Patrick, when you first shared this tidbit with me, I was definitely pleasantly surprised. It's definitely a very unique a unique aspect of the James Bond franchise.
Oh, that's family owned.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I hope they don't sell out to Disney or something like that. I'm praying.
Hope hopefully. But even before the release of Casino Royale, producer Michael G. Wilson announced that veteran writers Neil Purvis and Robert Wade were working on a script for the next film. And the duo deliberately wrote Casino Royale to tie into the next film so they could exploit Bond's emotions following Vesper's death in the previous film. And in July 2006, as Casino Royale entered post production, Eon Productions announced Roger Mitchell, who directed Craig in Enduring Love and The Mother, had entered negotiations to direct, and the next film would be based on an original idea by Wilson. So a release date of May 2008 was announced, which seemed ambitious at the time, and months later, Mitchell stepped down as director, citing the slow progress on the script. So, upon Mitchell's departure, Sony Vice Chairman Jeff Blake admitted a production schedule of 18 months was a very short window, and the release date was pushed back to November 2008. In April 2007, Purvis and Wade had completed the first draft of the script, and Paul Haggis, who had co written Casino Royale with them, began working on his rewrite the next month. The writers' strike began in November 2007, lasting until February 2008. Now, Hadges claims he completed his rewrites mere hours before the strike began. We're going to put a pin on that
Put a
because
pin in that.
we're gonna come back to it. And following
Yes.
Mitchell's departure, Tony Scott, Jonathan Mostow, Mark Foster, and Alex Proyas were all considered.
Forster.
Forster, Mark Forster, and Alex Proyas were all considered before the producers finally settled on Forster. Yeah.
And just to give the listeners some background, now the Bond fans will know this, but maybe casual listeners don't. Bond movies in the 60s, they came out every year. The first four were released 4 years in a row. Then, pretty much uninterrupted until 1989, they came out every other year. During the Brosnan years, they also were
Mm-hmm.
released every other year. The recent issue of them taking years to release these things is very much a recent thing. They used to crank these things out basically every 2 years. And for whatever reason, they just don't want to do that anymore. And I'm talking about Eon, Broccoli, and Wilson. But
Right.
that's something we can get into in future movies. So that's basically how the movie got made. Let's talk about why wasn't it better? Number one, the script or lack thereof. Anton,
Yeesh.
you in the production history, you told us about the writer's strike. There's no beating around the bush with this. The script is the Achilles heel of this movie. And the writer's strike severely handicapped this movie's chances for greatness. This is probably the most infamous victim of the 2007/8 writer's strike.
Who could forget it?
They actually this movie made me never forget it. They actually started filming this without a finished script, leading Daniel Craig and Mark Forster to rewrite scenes literally the day they were filming them. And in a December 2011 interview, Craig stated himself, quote, "We had the bare bones of a script and there was a writer's strike and there was nothing we could do. We couldn't employ a writer to finish it. I say to myself, never again, but who knows? That was me trying to rewrite scenes, and a writer I am not." End quote. He said that he and Forster were, quote, the ones allowed to do it. The rules were that you couldn't employ anyone as a writer, but the actor and director could work on scenes together. We were stuffed. We got away with it, but only just. It was never meant to be as much of a sequel as it was, but it ended up being a sequel, starting where the last one finished. End quote. A lot of the quotes that you read about the script, that makes me seriously doubt Haggis's claim that he finished everything before the strike began. All signs point to that not being the case. And Craig also stated, quote, "We had to cobble that one together because it was made in the midst of a writer's strike, and it had an effect on the finished product, no doubt," end quote. So you have the people that starred in and worked on the movie acknowledging what an issue this was. And recently, in 2021, on the Empire Film Podcast, Daniel Craig made an appearance, and he described the experience as a bit of a shit show, to say the least.
I mean, you touch on just how open a lot of these people attached to the film just say how difficult it is to just how difficult it is to put together a film, let alone have people outside of their death put in what should really be given to a proper writer.
Yeah,
This is definitely going to be a hurdle and an easy one to identify for the film, right?
yeah. I mean, it's there's just no way to get around it. Like I, I'm kind of surprised that they moved forward with filming despite the script issues. It's a little baffling to me that this franchise that has been around at this point for 40 plus years, they had nothing in the vault, they had nothing in the tank, they had no kind of a backup plan like, hey, okay, well, there's a writer's strike, but we have this script that we could pull from and maybe incorporate some elements. They didn't have anything like that as far as I could tell from the research. And on top of the obvious, the script issue, they also had the added pressure that of the decision to actually make this a direct sequel. As we mentioned when we talked about why we chose the film, that had never been done in the past 22 films. Now, Quantum of Solace itself is I'd say even the title itself is polarizing. A lot of people think it's a stupid title. Some people really like it. Whether or not you like it, it is from Ian Fleming. It's the name of a short story. Now, the short story itself has nothing to do with this movie. There's no crossover with the plot. They didn't take anything from the actual short story except for the title itself, other than naming the villain's organization Quantum. Any other script thoughts, Anton?
I think that writing, like being able to have a coherent story, you need a good writer and you need proper writing. Already, there's so much criticism when a competent writers come out with films, even just out of the box, just blockbuster films where you don't expect a lot, very formulaic. At least the writing's consistent. For something like this, it sounds like it was really going through the production with one hand behind their back when it came to the to the script aspect, which huge issue
Yeah,
for a very, very, very hyped film.
very expensive film too, which we'll talk about later on. Just some quick background before we get to the second reason on the actual writers. So Paul Haggis, he had worked on Casino Royale. Purvis and Wade were veterans of Bond movies at this point. They started working on the series in 1999. They wrote "The World Is Not Enough." They also gave us the war crime that was Die Another Day, and they had worked on Casino Royale with Haggis as well. So this would have been their fourth attempt at writing a Bond movie, and they are still working on the franchise to this day. Whatever you think of the subsequent films, Broccoli and Wilson, they have just like Barbara Broccoli, just like her father, Cubby Broccoli, she has a lot of loyalty to people that work on the franchise, and I think that's probably why Purvis and Wade have stuck around so long. They're, I think, just like this movie, just like the title, they are polarizing figures amongst the Bond fans.
Very good insight for those not into the to the Bond mythos.
I know way too much about this series. It's like I said, it's a somewhat unhealthy relationship with the franchise.
Well, why don't we dive into reason number two of why wasn't it better?
Yeah, Mark Forster as the director.
Ooh, ouch. Sorry, Forster.
Uh, yeah, as you touched on in the production history, Broccoli and Wilson, they settled on this guy, Mark Forster. He was not the first choice. Doesn't look like he was the second choice. But they saw the movie Finding Neverland and they were like, "That's our guy."
That
He
yeah. Ugh.
it's the wrong choice. There's a few different reasons why I think this. I know I can tell from the tone of your comment that you agree with me on this.
Oh, very much so.
How he wanted to tell this story and how he chose to direct the action tells me that he was the wrong choice. He had neither the skill nor the experience to pull off this kind of film. Now, I'm not making this up. Forster, he said that he was surprised he was approached for the job,
So
stating as
crazy.
he was not a big Bond fan, and he would not have accepted the job had he not seen Casino Royale, which he felt had humanized Bond. True. Since, quote, traveling the world had become less exotic since the series' advent, making it made sense to focus more on Bond as a character, end quote. He also has another quote about the story itself. Quote, because Bond plays it real, I thought the political circumstances should be real too, even though Bond shouldn't be a political film. I thought the more political I make it, the more real it feels. Not just with Bolivia and what's happening in Haiti, but with all these corporations like Shell and Chevron saying they're green because it's so fashionable to be green. During the Cold War, everything was very clear, the good guys and the bad guys. Today, there's much overlapping of good and bad. It wasn't as morally distinct because we all have both elements in us. End quote. Any reaction to those statements from Mark Forster?
So while I don't disagree in Forster's assessment of climate, that's a lot to put in a film, right? Those are a
Yes.
lot of aspects that can make a plot very heavy, and it takes quite a story and script and quite a director to be able to convey it in a way that's digestible. Otherwise, you'll get too many aspects of one or the other that'll drag and make you wonder why are these aspects in the film, which for some reason I feel like didn't that happen in this film?
The problem with what he's saying is that I agree with you in principle. Like everything that he's saying, I, I hear it, right? Like, oh, okay, that makes sense. More political, more real. It's like, Mark, you're talking about a Bond movie. Making trying to make something more real by making it more, quote, more political. Okay, that's true. It also makes it more boring. If
Yep.
there's one thing that the James Bond formula has established, words like real and political, they have no part in it. Bond is pure escapism. It's fantastical in nature. Now, you can debate how far the series should push those fantastical elements, right? Like how grounded should the series should be? Like, do you need Moonraker? Do you need You Only Live Twice? Do you need Die Another Day? And you look at something, Casino Royale is pretty grounded.
Right.
My point is this: nobody ever went to see a Bond movie expecting super realistic stuff. They go to a Bond movie for escapism. I don't want to go to a Bond movie to see something that's realistically political in nature. I think his initial thoughts on his approach to this just completely wrong from square one.
No, I agree. I agree with you there. There's people now. I think this is part of my challenge to those expectations. Like with any long-standing franchise, is how do you keep a character or franchise fresh, especially when every either director or every attempt kind of follows a similar formula. I do find that there's something noble in trying to inject something new to drive just to drive something new and novel into a franchise that's been along for a while. So trying to make a more grounded, more realistic Bond, yeah, I do think that that's great. But it's in trying
Yes,
to
I agree.
do it. But it's in trying to completely flip the franchise on its head to make a very what like a basically a PSA film, or just trying to turn the film into something that the vehicle of the film itself is not meant to be. Like it's not. It's you're meant to enjoy like munching on popcorn and seeing this film, and not. It shouldn't be a head scratcher at the end of the day.
No, you make an excellent point though, because you've seen all the old ones,
Oh,
all the old
yeah.
Bond movies. Now they have done. I think one of the reasons that the franchise has managed to successfully survive over the years is they have reinvented themselves. For every ridiculous Moonraker you get a For Your Eyes Only, right?
Right.
Like we both of us hate Die Another Day. It's a ridiculous movie, but I think you have to acknowledge that out of the ashes of that tragedy, you got Casino Royale, right? They've always been able to reinvent the franchise in some way, shape, or form. The tones have shifted. The Connery films had a specific tone. Actually, the early Connery films had a specific tone. The the last two official Connerys got a lot bigger, jumped the shark pretty much. Roger Moore was known as more camp and more lighthearted. Timothy Dalton, while he didn't do many, he only did two, but he brought a seriousness to the role that probably laid the groundwork for what Craig would do later on. The Brosnan era was very definitive and different from the previous ones. So, to your point, they've always been able to reinvent this franchise in some way. It's just a question of how much and how extreme do you want to take it? Well, I don't know if Forster himself was quite sure what he wanted to do with this because I have another quote from him. It's quite telling. Quote, this is Forster's words himself. Quote, I thought, okay, maybe I should pull out because we didn't have a finished script. But everybody said, no, we need to make the movie. The strike will be over shortly, so you can start shooting what we have and then we'll finish everything else. I said, yeah, but the time crunch. So ultimately, I said, okay. The idea was to make a follow up to Casino Royale, and ultimately I felt like, okay, worst case scenario, the strike goes on. I'll just make sort of like a 70s revenge movie, very action driven, lots of cuts to hide that there's a lot of action and a little less story to disguise it. End quote. Well, this didn't
Yeah.
do the movie any favors. He decided to, and look, I don't want to completely blame him because he was working with an unfinished script, but he decided to go heavy up on the action, and ultimately what we get is an action movie where the action is the worst thing about the movie.
Yeah. It's that quote's very telling, isn't it?
It is. Now, Paul Haggis in the original script that he, may or may not have finished, he the location of the climax in this script was located in the Swiss Alps, but Forster Forster wanted the action sequences to be based around the four classical elements of earth, water, air, and fire. He ultimately chose the Atacama Desert to represent Bond's vengefulness in the climax of this movie. This is
Wow.
this is
Wow.
this is some amateur film student shit. I could not believe this when I was doing the research. Like yeah, I don't want to rail on this too much. I understand what he was trying to do to bring some kind of an art house approach to this movie, but that really opens the question: is that good for a Bond movie?
I would say no.
You're just the listeners can't see this, but Anton is just slowly shaking his head.
No.
not really sure what to say. No, it's not.
Look, I've it's a very loaded term, right? Art house, because there are some art house films that are very good. I like to think
Oh,
maybe,
I'm not disputing that.
yeah,
I'm not
I think
disputing
like
that.
maybe avant-garde, or maybe again, it's like taking a lot of elements to, even when you think of cinematography, the art of the director to be able to really take the vision and really inject more nuance into the film and the layering. Like you said, that's some film student shit, and
Yeah,
you could really see that in trying to layer in these elements to make the film seem deep. But it's a Bond film. Shouldn't it be fun?
yeah. It. I texted. I think I texted you this earlier. I just want my Bond to have fun.
Exactly.
That's what I want. Yeah, the action in here. There's quite a bit of it. It's actually, it's not compared to Casino Royale. This is a very short film. Casino Royale was about 2.5 hours, and this is like an hour 45.
Hmm.
There's a lot of action in this, and it's very much influenced by the Jason Bourne movies. And it's not a coincidence that this movie had the same second unit director as I think the latter two Bourne movies, or no, in the first trilogy of the Bourne that was directed by Paul Greengrass, because I think there's a couple more Bournes after that, regardless. But it doesn't have the same level of execution that the Bourne movies do. Forster has a very poor understanding of spatial geography. I'm going to come back to that term in a bit. This movie in particular has some of the most nauseating, quick cut, choppy editing that I've ever seen, and it renders a lot of the action scenes incoherent. The camera is never still, the shots don't linger enough for you to actually absorb them, and everything feels glossed over like you're skimming a book as opposed to reading it. It's very different stylistically to Casino Royale, which only makes the decision to make this a direct sequel more curious, right?
Right, right.
The camera placement, and again, this is something you can blame on Forster. The camera placement's all over the place. Sometimes there's extreme close-ups, sometimes it's far away. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. And the opening car chase is probably one of the biggest offenders of this. I think if it were edited in a better way, it would be a very well filmed car chase, right? But because of the way it's cut, there's a bunch of pretty insightful YouTube videos that like cover this. You can't tell. It's very difficult to tell how many cars are even chasing Bond's Aston Martin. It's very difficult to tell like when how does how does his driver's door get ripped off? When does it get ripped off? And it's kind of a shame because you can tell that they spent an awful lot of money on filming it. And ditto for the action scene that immediately follows it after the opening titles during the when Mr. White escapes and in the ensuing fight when Bond fights Mitchell, and Mitchell's important because they say his name like 5 times. Hello, Mitchell. Check the perimeter, Mitchell. Good to see you, Mitchell. When Mitchell intervenes to like free White, and he's escaping, and Bond's chasing him, and they keep cross cutting between Bond fighting Mitchell and that stupid horse race, and then the editing as well in that scene. I don't know if you noticed this, but I was reading this online. I thought the same thing when I first saw this movie. I thought M got shot during that scene, but she doesn't.
What? That
There,
was just
well,
like with a camera play.
yeah, it was just because of the editing. And then
Oh,
later, when Bond tackles Mitchell and they fall through that glass roof, it looks like CGI, but they actually did that stunt for real. And it's actually a really impressive stunt, but it's ruined by how they edited it and how they did the color grading on the film. It ends up looking like CGI, but it's actually something they did for real.
yeah. It's different schools of thought, and like you said, you can really put it on the director for
Yeah.
how to display the scene to the audience. Is do you show all of the scene and the impact with one shot to follow the journey or the pace, or do you do jump cuts to either drive what the director feels like is more intensity for a scene, and here it just translates very poorly.
A lot of the other action scenes are like this. When Bond fights that guy Slate in Haiti in in the hotel room, it looks like he's fighting a stunt double. They hired someone that looked like Bond. We'll get to that a little bit later, as for plot
Mm,
reasons, but because of the way it's cut, it should have been a great fight. But he's fighting someone that looks so similar to him that it's hard to tell what's going on. And then during that boat chase, it's unclear. But Camille, the quote unquote Bond girl, she gets knocked out. It's never really explained what happened to her. She just kind of later appears in the movie.
yeah,
And
that
then
was a weird one.
I don't know, like what would you say was the best action scene in the movie? Did you have one that like stood out for you? Or like, well, at least this is good.
It's so funny that you mentioned that because one thing I was reflecting on was something that's very I like to think of in some more of the recent Bond films, or even like chase scenes. Is just how do you capture like a great chase scene, whether especially like you think of the first Daniel Craig film really opens with you get an introduction for a very animalistic, vengeful Daniel Craig chasing after a villain in the first one.
Oh,
And in this
the
one,
parkour scene.
yeah, the parkour scene. In
Yeah,
this
it's
one,
amazing.
and in this one, the, it's really hard to think of an action scene that was able to capture the same just fun, or just capture the same like able to capture the consistency of being able to follow the scene in a digestible way.
I there isn't. I was trying to rack my brain, like, all right, was there one good action scene in this movie? I don't think there is. Do you remember? Okay, so the opera scene in here.
Mm,
Did you see Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation?
I did not actually.
Huh. I'm kind of blown away by that.
Yeah, I did not
You're a
actually see that one.
pretty savvy moviegoer.
I
All
did
right.
not
Well,
see
you
that
need
one.
to because there is a very similar opera scene in that movie that is far better executed, far better filmed, far better edited, and that now Quantum of Solace obviously came years before that, but you want to talk about like an opera action scene that's poorly executed versus a good one. Those two movies are pretty good ones to compare.
Mm,
Now, during the plane chase, I don't know if you remember this part of the movie. Bad CGI, and it's just again very difficult to tell what's going on. So there's a book I read a couple years back called The Conversations. It's a nonfiction book about movie making, and it's written by a legendary editor named Walter Murch. He was also a sound designer. I think he's still alive, but he very famously edited movies like Apocalypse Now. He worked on the Godfather movies, and he is a multiple Oscar winner for editing as well as sound. He won an Oscar for The English Patient, and this book is co-written by novelist Michael Ondaatje. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, but he wrote the novel The English Patient. He talked in this book. Murch is talking about where the audience is. If you're watching a movie, if you're the audience, where your eye is focused on the film as it moves from cut to cut, right? As it moves from edit to edit. He described an invisible dot somewhere on the frame, right? And the focus on the next shot should be where the dot is at its first frame. Now, there's exceptions, right? Where if he wants the audience to be disoriented, he'll move the dot somewhere else. This is what I mentioned a little bit earlier about spatial geography. Forster, the director of this movie, he seems to have no grasp of this. And it kind of makes sense that he had never directed an action movie before. This was his first foray into action, and I just he was the wrong choice for this movie. But to build on Mersch's comments, just to give a little bit more of a definition to actually what spatial geography is it's the spatial relationship between the characters and the objects within the setting in which the movie or scene is taking place.
You hear that,
So in
listeners?
almost every action scene,
We're really getting into directorial theory here.
yeah, well, it's a little bit of like a nerdy film term, but when I first learned about it a few years ago, I never watched another movie the same way. Like, I'll give you an example, Anton. The first Die Hard movie. The whole
Right.
thing takes place in the skyscraper, right? But McTiernan, who directed the movie, is like a master of action, right? Within 10 minutes, you have a really good understanding of where everything is supposed to take place, right? The building's under construction. It's mostly abandoned. There's a part that's 40 stories. The party's on the 30th floor. And McClane, when he first escapes the terrorists, he goes down a couple floors. All the action is taking place within 5 or 6 stories of each other. And because that movie is so well directed and so well filmed and so well edited, it has really good spatial geography. You're never confused about where John McClane is, where are the terrorists. You have a really good sense, even when he goes up to the roof and he's in the
Yeah.
elevator shaft, you have a really good sense of where he is in relation to all the other characters. You have the total opposite in this movie, right? You just don't know where are the other characters in relation to each other? Where are they? Where are they going? Are they going from point A to point B? Are they going in a circle? It's
Oh, it's
very difficult
confusing.
to tell what's going on. Spielberg is another master of spatial geography, right? Like, even if you don't like Steven Spielberg's movies, which you're crazy if you don't, but
Right.
he really knows how to stage action. Same thing with Christopher Nolan. He has a really great understanding of this. I know I just went down a rabbit hole there, but I feel that it's a very important thing to hit on when you're talking about this movie.
Well, not only when you're talking about movies, but critically, how can we look at directors and how scenes have been shot and then put into the film? It can translate very poorly, and this is the
Yes.
kind of stuff that I feel like listeners need to think about when we're really going at them with very objective reasons of like why this is critically not great directing.
Yeah. It's I think his lack of action experience was an issue for Forster, but when you bring the script issues into it and just the lack of a script, it takes just a super competent and confident director to make that work. I haven't seen Finding Neverland, and I know he's directed other movies, and by all accounts he is a good director, but he was the wrong choice for this.
So I saw Finding Neverland. It's not necessarily like a horrible film. And actually, when you think about the context of that film and the magical realism it involves, the way that it's shot and the story is trying to tell, and the pacing, I think it's the pacing that makes sense. Um, Probably a better kind of movie for Forster. A Bond film, not really.
I think we have probably beat on Mark Forster enough, and
Yeah.
let's let's talk about the third reason why this wasn't better: the plot and the villain. Now, both of these things are related to I think the script, but the writer's strike, it meant there wasn't a completed script. This is one of the weakest Bond villain plots in the series, and I say that knowing full well most of the plots in Bond movies are completely ridiculous. But because they wanted to make this quote more political, this is about as dull as it gets. If there's one thing most Bond films have in common, or at least the good ones, it's an interesting villain, or at least a memorable villain, and the plot, right?
Oh,
This movie
huge.
has neither.
Well. Not
Yeah.
only that, it's got to have a villain that has some sort of like facial deformity, right?
Yeah. There, right. You may not think it's a good villain, but it's memorable. This movie doesn't have either one of those things. I,
Nope.
Bond
Nope.
in this movie, Bond basically thwarts a corrupt businessman. Like we're talking about Bolivian water rights. They
But
actually made that the crux of the plot.
I was reading an
Bolivian water
article.
rights.
Well, I was reading an article on just the departure for really putting Green as the main villain in this film, and one of the key reasons is letting the ugliness of the character speak more so for the character's essence versus any facial deformity or any just distinct characteristics that's more traditional with Bond films. And I was like, okay, I guess I get that. But even then, the villain, this is a very weak villain, right?
He's weak for a number of reasons. Oh, look, I just because it's a movie we're going to cover at some point soon. The whole Bolivian water rights thing, that is every bit as dull as the trade negotiation stuff in Phantom Menace. Like when they
Oh,
start talking about the water rights in here, you're just like, oh,
yeah. People don't come to this.
someone just make espresso and wake me up. Yeah, the Green
But
himself, played
I
by
will say
Matthew
this though.
Almeric.
Don't get me into a spiral talking about how the trade negotiations actually influenced the Federation into ousting the Jedi, that as they would be putting themselves as a clear barrier between free trade and the Federation. But that'll like let me don't let me go there because I will go there.
Look, when we get to the Phantom Menace, which we're gonna have to do, we're each gonna probably have to go through a bottle of wine to get through the discussion about that movie. And the Trade Federation stuff, I don't know if it's going to be interesting, but it's going to be fun.
It's gonna be
You
fun
seem
because
to
this.
know your Galactic Senate trade negotiation
Well, the
details, though.
super nerd in me knows that it is pivotal to understanding the politics of why it happened, and I can see why storyline wise they had to put it in. But then the film fan
Really?
in me knows they really should not have put it in because no one's going to care about what was really driving, what were the political overtones driving the direction of the Clone Wars.
Look, there's an alternate universe where the Nemoidians are the good guys.
Right.
And if you don't know who the Nemoidians are, then you are not a real Star Wars fan. Yeah, you don't think George Lucas thought that through when he incorporated that stuff into the movie?
I think that well, I'll just say this. I think that there is a lot of lore in I think there is a lot of lore written into Star Wars. In there's a lot of
Yeah.
lore written in the Star Wars that we're going to have to make sure that we also look at other areas in popular culture and compare and see like how do those make parallels into the storylines,
You could
because
make it a parallel to Bolivian water rights in Quantum of Solace.
oh there, and that brings us back to this Bond of a film.
Dominic Green, he is definitely a weak villain. He's not a believable adversary to Bond. And back to the Bolivian water rights of it all. As far as I know, what he was trying to do in this movie, it's not even illegal. It's unethical. Like Nestle does this in various countries, control the water rights, but
Right.
I don't think it's illegal. Can I at least get a Bond villain plot that's against the law? Like hijack some nukes or something.
Maybe I think when we think about how Green went about his corporate villainy, it was more so not getting the right signatures on the right forms to actually put it through. So that's why Bond had to take him out. Is that maybe fair?
Well, yeah, it might be. I even have a problem with the name and all the names in here: Green, White, Slate. Uh, Green's brother, his name is Elvis. Can we put any effort into less generic names? Think about the whole Bond series, right? The name, like Goldfinger, Blofeld, Columbo, Largo, Stromberg, Max Zorin, Doctor No, Francisco Scaramanga, even someone like Gustav Graves, who was the villain in Die Another Day, which is a terrible movie. Even Gustav Graves is a better name than Dominic Green.
Well, again, let's think about how bare bones of a script that folks were working with.
Yeah,
Who
it's
do we
true.
even know? Who even wrote these names?
I That's a really good question. I've never gotten a really good look into actually what was in the original quote unquote finished script versus what Craig and Mark Subaru
Or
Forster added
here,
later on.
I'm gonna throw this at you. What if Forrester was thinking, well, he's the main villain. It's an eco-friendly plot driving his villainy. Let's make his name Green because he's actually not very green at all.
Yeah, I think that's probably you. Probably, I think you just blew a hole in it.
uh,
My favorite thing too. I didn't notice this initially, but I did upon. I've rewatched this movie a few times. So Green runs, to your point, an eco-friendly charity, but he's also engaging in oil exploration, and that doesn't set off any red flags.
yep,
Because
it's a good one.
oh, but did you notice who plays? What's the name of the actor? He's famous now, but he wasn't then. He plays Felix Leiter's boss.
I'm trying to
He's
think.
in Stranger Things.
Oh, I can't think of the name, but I know who you're talking about.
It's embarrassing we can't remember his name
Yeah,
now. He wasn't famous then. A couple other problems with just the plot. So the marked bill scheme with how they link that guy Slate, which is Pierce or not Pierce Brosnan, Daniel Craig's stunt double that he kills in Haiti. That guy's name's Slate. They link him to Lashif, who was the villain in Casino Royale, but
who?
they link him to Lashif with like this marked bill
Right.
scheme. It's not clear how that happens, but then Bond's just like, okay, I need to go to Haiti. It's kind of flimsy. And that guy that Slate, the guy that he ends up killing, the reason why he looks so much like him, I don't know if you noticed this. So he puts on the guy's jacket, he goes downstairs in that motel, and the hotel receptionist thinks that he is that guy, just hands him
Right.
the plot point. Like here's a briefcase with your next mission. It's
Oh,
very much
that's
like
a great.
it's like a video it's like
That's
a
a
video game
that's a
setup.
great analogy. Oh my gosh.
That's what it reminded me of. But again, you could probably chalk that up to the script. A lot of things like that happen without rhyme or reason. Like he we'll get to this a bit later. Another problem I have with the plot, he Bond and Camille, played by Olga Kurilenko, they kind of stumble into Quantum's water hijacking scheme. And back to the opera thing real quick. I will say this. At least it's the only part of the movie where Bond is doing actual spy work, where he takes the guy's identity, he puts on the tuxedo, he listens in on Quantum's organizational meeting, and he's taking pictures of the various members. Right? It's actually I think that is actually the best part of the movie because he's doing actual spy work.
Right. Some real espionage going on.
Yeah, and that does unearth the actual part of the plot that I think was semi interesting. Quantum's infiltration of world governments, where they're like, oh,
Remember
this guy
that?
Guy Haynes, he's an advisor to the prime minister. That's actually pretty
Which
interesting.
is which is when I think of that film, that when you think of like kind of a cool aspect, um, that lends itself to reality, corporation,
Yes,
like
yes,
how corporations do have a hold on governments, which is it is interesting.
definitely. That's the best part of the movie. They don't go very far with it, though. I mentioned that Guy Haynes. They mention him in the movie a couple times. He's supposed to be important, right? Because you see him at the opera from a distance, and Bond takes pictures of him. He's supposed to be this close advisor to the prime minister. He never really appears in the movie again, though, or does anything. Now, have you ever played the video game Quantum of Solace?
I can't say I've had the pleasure.
It's I would not call it a great game, but it's kind of cool because there is an alternate ending to that game where it's different than the ending of this movie. So in the ending of the video game, Bond kills Haynes and Mr. White. They filmed like a cutscene actually for
Oh,
this movie. They didn't end up using it. And if you go on YouTube, you can't actually find the alternate ending, but you can find behind the scene footage of them filming the alternate scene, and you can see the actor that plays Mr. White. I think his name is Jesper Christensen, but I could be mistaken. You can actually see him filming the scene where he's trying to kill Guy Haynes and Bond intervenes
I see.
and ends up killing them both. Yeah, it's pretty cool, and it's you gotta wonder why. They obviously Mr. White would end up resurfacing in
I,
Spectre.
I do want to make a very bold exclamation at this point. Now that we've talked about the Bond games, GoldenEye was not my favorite Bond game. It
Really,
was it was Nightfire.
I like Nightfire. You
I
like
don't
that
know.
more than Goldeneye?
I like Nightfire more than GoldenEye. GoldenEye, like, there's a lot of nostalgia that speaks to why people really enjoyed GoldenEye, and it was a very influential game. But I spent so many hours playing Nightfire in college.
I like Nightfire.
That
That's
one,
an interesting.
it captured the. If you really felt more like Bond playing playing Nightfire than playing GoldenEye.
I've never heard anyone say that before. I respect you for that.
Yep.
I like Nightfire. I liked Agent Under Fire.
I wasn't quite.
By the way, we couldn't remember his name earlier. David Harbour.
There we go. David Harbour.
Yeah,
Uh, the
I'm
the one
so
time the
embarrassed I
one
didn't
time
remember his name
Hellboy.
earlier. Yeah, I this was gotta be one of his earliest movies, 2008. That's a
Very
while
early.
ago.
Looked very different.
Yeah, he's kind of portrayed as like a goof with the mustache, and he's like, "Sure, you can look for oil."
Uh, Jeez.
But back to the plot of this movie and just the villain's plan in general. There's a lot of haphazard decisions. Like when they bring Renee Mathis back into this, if you think about what happened to Mathis in Casino Royale, like why is he cool with Bond? He should be pissed off at him. And instead, so Bond, also the timeline's strange because at the ending of that movie, Mathis gets kidnapped isn't the right word, but he gets detained by the British authorities and presumably, let's call it enhanced interrogation, to
Right.
borrow
That's
a Bush administration term.
right.
And then, so cut to this movie, he's living on like a villa on this island in Italy, and Bond visits him, and he's just totally cool with Bond. He's just like, "Yeah, Vesper really loved you." He knew Vesper for 2 days.
It made no sense.
Casino Royale takes place when Bond actually gets to the card game in Montenegro and meets Mathis and Vesper on the, Vesper. He meets Vesper on the train. He meets Mathis when he gets to Montenegro. That card game takes place over a period of maybe 2 or 3 days. And now you have in this movie, Mathis is just like, Vesper really loved you. You need to forgive her. It's like, dude, you knew her for 2 days. What are you talking about?
Barely. Also, just but trying to capture what like a romantic thread, trying to capture that romantic thread to really also deepen Bond's humanity in this film. Oh, come on now.
Look, as you know, if you've seen all the movies, they ride the Vesper scooter a very long time.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that was a good one.
You're welcome.
That was a good one.
So when Mathis dies, you're welcome. When Mathis dies, Bond's treatment of him is about as ice cold as it gets.
Oh,
Tosses him
rough.
in a dumpster. Backtracking really quick, my favorite scene in this movie is when it's very brief. When Bond and Mathis are on the plane flying to Bolivia, and it's one of the very rare times in the series you actually see Bond drunk. If you remember, it's like a 2 minute scene. He's on the
It's
plane in first class at the bar, and he's pounding Vesper martinis.
and one would think one would think a world class secret agent can hold their liquor, but what does that
He definitely
say?
can. He has six of them.
But what does that say though about
Well,
Bond
I
downing
would.
a bunch of Vesper martinis
He's trying to drown his sorrows, trying to remember this woman that he fell in love with
that has
and who
huge
betrayed
influence
him.
over him? And
Yeah. If you're gonna defend this movie in terms of its humanization of James Bond, that's probably the scene that you would pick. And I really do like that scene. It's very brief, but it's it's well acted by Daniel Craig. It's a rare look at Bond, his human side, and you as many alcoholic drinks as he consumes over the course of this whole series, you very probably never see him drunk except for this one
yep.
part. And it's I just wanted to give that a little bit of a shout out because I don't know if the listeners can tell at this point an hour in, but we don't love this movie.
Oh, we do not.
No. And look, plowing ahead here, I'm gonna skip a couple of our notes because we are really taking this apart. But other problems with the plot. So the secondary Bond girl in this movie, Strawberry Fields, played by
Oh,
Gemma Atherton.
Strawberry Fields. What a
I
character.
have I have in my notes here. They might as well have just sent Bond a stripper for the weekend.
It's a I thought at the time clever name, but
Eh.
weird
Well,
placement.
they don't say Strawberry Fields. She describes herself as just Fields. But she exists only to die, drowned in oil. A very not so subtle reference to Goldfinger.
To Goldfinger, right?
Yeah. Yeah, look, the writer's strike really did impact the plot. So I mentioned you may have mentioned the plane scene, the flying scene
Right.
when they're flying over the
The
desert.
desert, yeah.
They're flying over the desert looking. Bond and Camille. They rent this plane. They're flying over the desert looking for dot 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 something. They don't know what they're looking for, but there might be something going on. The plane. They have the encounter with the fighter jets, and they have to eject or not eject, but they actually have to like jump out of the plane with a parachute. But good thing they land on right on top of the thing that they didn't even know what they were looking for. They land in like that cave, and Bond's like, "It's the water. He's hoarding water. It's the plot of Chinatown."
Forget about it. Forget about it, Patrick. It's Chinatown.
The CGI, and I don't know. Did you notice how bad the CGI was in that movie?
If you notice it,
Not
it
in the
was
movie.
bad.
In that
In the
scene,
scene.
it's bad.
If you
Well,
notice it,
the
it was
the
bad.
the reason why it's particularly bad. This is a $230 million movie, and this costs almost twice as much as Casino Royale's budget. Doesn't look
Does
doesn't look twice as
does
good.
not look it.
No, James Bond. It's a good thing that James Bond was there to make water more affordable for Bolivians. That's all I can say. And the third act is just garbage. It's not just the story, but so the climax of the movie takes place in this, like, it's like in a luxury hotel in the middle of nowhere, right? It's in the middle of the desert.
Right.
It I guess it's still under construction because there's really no one that's staying in the hotel. You don't see much of it. I kind of got the impression that they were running out of money by this point because it's supposed to be a hotel, but like I said, you don't really see any other guests, and the entire hotel is just flammable. It's like the walls were coated in kerosene. Everything starts to catch fire, and everything starts to explode as soon as the fight begins.
It was it also happened really fast. Would you say that? Would you agree? Yeah.
Yes, the movie in general happens fast. I think
Right.
if it's one of the positive things you could say about it is the pacing is pretty rapid.
Right. It it there weren't too many scenes where you kind of felt like it 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 lingered on a conversation for too long. But even here I kind of felt like maybe they could have dealt with a bit more just dwelling, especially considering like the size of the scene, the depth of the scene.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about just to rail on the writing again. If you remember Green, when they're about to when Green's about to fight Bond with the axe, he taunts Bond, and he hears a gunshot and he yells at Bond, "Looks like you just lost another one." It's bad storytelling. How does he know Camille is even there in the hotel? He hasn't seen her. Because he was referencing the fact that, like, oh, every woman that you come in contact with seems to die,
Right.
and he tells Bond, "Oh, looks like you just lost another one." He doesn't know Camille's there. Just
It's
dead silence from Anton.
a lame taunt, but bad writing.
It is.
But
It
it's
is.
trying to be but you know it's trying to be smart, and that's what makes it even worse.
Yes, it is. My wife pointed out something when we were. I made my wife watch this. She was not happy about it,
Sure, she loved it.
but she well, it's my wife likes a lot of Bond movies. She really liked Casino Royale. She really likes Skyfall. She likes most of the Connery ones. She was miserable during this movie, but she pointed out something really funny, which I did not realize. I've seen this movie probably 10 times at this point, just because I like Bond movies. I watch them. This is what I do.
Right, right.
So Camille is supposed to be Bolivian, and
Oh
they really
gosh.
cement this by casting a Ukrainian actress in the role. That's not the issue, though. So it was one of the later scenes. My wife pointed out they have her in dark makeup to make her skin darker.
That's pretty
I did not.
bold.
It's it's a very it's a very strange decision in 2008, and I'm wondering why that decision was made. Now, that being said, this is an example of should they probably have cast a more an actress that could have portrayed a Bolivian better physically, maybe. But that being said, I do think Olga Kurilenko is one of the highlights of this movie. I actually do like her performance as
Fair.
Camille. I think she gives a good performance.
Distressed,
Yeah,
passionate.
yeah. I liked the fact that she doesn't sleep with Bond at the end, and if you actually want to apply the context of her character and her story arc, it makes sense that she wouldn't sleep with Bond at the end, even though in every other Bond movie the Bond girl does end up with Bond.
Right.
She doesn't. But I think it does work for her character. I think that's a plus in the movie's favor.
Any other pluses in that go towards the movie at all?
Oh yeah, I think as always, I think Daniel Craig's performance as Bond is excellent. I do like Craig. I think he's a good actor. My problems with my problems with Craig's movies after Casino Royale are never going to be his fault. I think his performance as Bond he does great work. And
Yes.
one of the pluses of this movie is how good he looks in this movie, wardrobe wise. All of the suits he wears look great.
Look great.
This is also so in Casino Royale. So Pierce Brosnan in Casino Royale, you had Brioni making the suits. Tom Ford makes the suits for this movie. They look great. Tom Ford's debut. That Harrington jacket that Craig wears in the climax at the explosible hotel looks good. That black shawl colored, the shawl collared cardigan that he wears when he
Hmm.
goes to visit Mathis looks great. Very Steve McQueen look he has in this movie. And shout out to the Omega Planet Ocean that he's wearing as his watch throughout this movie.
Dang,
Beautiful.
good call. Right. I've always liked the Rolex selection for when I think of Bond films throughout in terms of wristwear, but very good
Oh,
call on
like
that.
the Connerys.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we have not seen a Rolex in Bond, I think, since License to Kill, 1989. It's been
Yeah.
all Omega since then. Well, I'll say this. I hear you on the Rolex thing, but as someone that actually was able to buy an Omega, Omega is way more attainable than a Rolex. You can get an Omega Seamaster for a couple grand. Good luck trying to find a Rolex Submariner from that era.
Oh, easy. You're spending more than like 10K.
Yeah, it's outrageous.
Yeah. We're not sponsored by Omega, by the way,
We're not. We're not. I
but we
wish we
won't say
were.
no.
Look, if Omega wants to throw us a bone, we'll take every bone. Is anything else you want to mention, Anton? Oh, Jeffrey Wright as Felix Leiter. He makes an appearance in this movie. I always like Jeffrey Wright.
Jeffrey writes a very good moral compass character.
Yeah,
He's like always like got to do the right thing.
he does. So the fourth reason why this wasn't better, I think the need for this to be a sequel in general. And every time I watch this movie, I do a mental exercise. If the name James Bond was not uttered in this movie, would you be able to recognize this as a James Bond movie?
That's a great question. Um, you might recall earlier on in the podcast, in this episode I'd mentioned this was a film that really consciously and sometimes out of its own hands moved away from what we traditionally think of with Bond films, right?
Yes.
And we see it throughout.
They're almost like anti-Bond stuff that they decided to do here. The gun barrel logo, it's at the end.
Right.
He doesn't say Bond, James Bond. The Bond theme, the music itself, never happens in this movie. Even though I think I do want to mention David Arnold's score, I think overall is very good here. I really like what David Arnold did for this series in general. And this is the last time David Arnold ever worked on this series, but we don't get the Bond theme.
But the villain decision, um the leading,
Yeah.
how he interacts with the lead, the female lead. Now, I touched on it before. I still stand by it. For anything that goes for a long time, for long-standing franchises, being able to move away from what traditionally has worked, or being able to provide something novel and new, I applaud that. Even for types of storytelling, subversion of expectation, that's fun. When you do that in this film for no reason, it felt like almost for no reason, or the reasons didn't stick. It ends up just feeling very hollow, and it ends up feeling like, was that a good film? And
I know what you mean.
I think that this film tried to tell a smart story, but didn't have the script or the directing or the execution to really pull it off.
No, I mean you have to the decision to make this a direct sequel. I think was a very bizarre one. It tried to copy the perceived success of Casino Royale, right? Like Casino Royale worked because it was gritty and it. Some people don't think Casino Royale was a traditional Bond movie, even though it is. And the producers, maybe due to the lack of script, I don't really know, but they tried to double down on the seriousness, right, for this movie. They
Mm-hmm.
tried to capitalize on the realism and the grittiness, but that's all this is. It lacks the story that Casino Royale had. Casino Royale had very strong source material to draw from, and it's very faithful to the novel. Casino Royale was the first Bond novel that Ian Fleming published, and the movie is, I would say, mostly faithful to the novel. They add some stuff, they subtract some stuff, like any adaptation will do. But with this sequel, Quantum of Solace, they made a conscious decision to just start winging it with the story. You can obviously blame that on the script. It's just very puzzling that they decided to do it and they didn't make any sort of effort to like just maybe delay it. And Daniel Craig said it himself in that interview, quote, "It was never meant to be as much of a sequel as it was, but it ended up being a sequel," end quote. And that really begs the question, did Casino Royale need a direct sequel to begin with? I don't think it did. I thought
No,
the
no.
story that they wanted to tell got concluded in Casino Royale. Even with Vesper, they would keep riding that Vesper scooter for another few movies. But this movie relies heavily on Casino Royale, but it doesn't build anything. Every time I watch this movie, I just get the sense that we're treading water. We're not really moving forward. It feels like a an unnecessary and almost like an hour and 40-minute post credit scene for Casino Royale.
I feel like
That's what I think of when I watch this movie.
I feel like the film could have had more legs if it was on its own a different story about trying to tell about non-eco-friendly corporate overlords. I think that
Yeah.
you have a lot of different you had a lot of different things pulling the film here. You have like the corporate heads that say, "Hey, the first Casino Royale killed it in the box office. We have really high expectations. Go ahead and greenlight another film really fast, and we want it. We want people to be reminded about how good that first film was. So add elements from the first film. You have a new
Yeah.
director tied to the film that, for through their own artistic vision, wants to subvert expectations of what a Bond film is, while also having orders from up above that to make this a sequel that also ties into the original storyline. And then you have another tie-in of a writer strike, not allowing to really flesh out a story for something that was originally a short story that didn't have connection to the Casino Royale storyline. So we have ourselves a lot of different elements that really didn't set itself up to be a successful sequel. So if you try to do too much in one direction, you end up not being pulled enough into the other direction. And then, as you said, that's how you get floundering.
Well said. So former James Bond Sir Roger Moore, this is his review of the movie. I think it sums it up perfectly. Roger Moore, who is maybe my favorite Bond.
Okay.
Maybe you weren't expecting that,
I
but
was not.
anyway, he
I
said
was
about
not.
this movie, maybe his movies are like a warm blanket. They're very comforting. But he said about this movie, quote, "Craig is a damn good Bond, but the film as a whole, there was a bit too much flash cutting and it was just like a commercial of the action. There didn't seem to be any geography and you were wondering what the hell was going on," end quote. Pretty
True.
good. Pretty good review.
Yeah.
Real quick before we wrap this up, we can't talk about a Bond movie without talking about the music. What'd you think of the title song by Jack White
Uh,
and Alicia Keys?
I
Another Way
really
to Die.
I'm a fan of the White Stripes. I like
Same.
yeah, so I actually thought it was a banger.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I thought it sucked,
No, I
but it
actually
was
do like
terrible.
the it
Interesting.
it's I thought that I still listen to it.
Oh, okay. I do like Jack White. White Stripes fan for sure. I do like Alicia Keys. I don't think they work well together, but I respect it. Quick anecdote about this song. It was originally it was going to be a different song, but the title song was originally supposed to be sung by Amy Winehouse, but she was having too many personal issues at the time. And then the rumor has it they were going to go with Shirley Bassey to do the title
Historic.
song. That yeah, oh for sure, it would have been her fourth. Well, yeah, because she did Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, Moonraker. Yeah, so this would have been her fourth. But they eventually settled on Another Way to Die. Yeah. So Anton, we talked about. Oh, this is already our longest episode. This is good. I'm loving it.
Oh yeah.
We talked about why this wasn't better. It was the lack of the script. Mark Forster as the director being the wrong choice. The plot and the villain just very weak. Again, probably because of the script issues. And then the storytelling and the actual need for this to be a direct sequel was unnecessary. Taking all of that into account, what is your rating of this movie and your overall impression of it in the Bond overall legacy?
Uh, I would put it bottom, like in the lower tier of Bond films. It was not my favorite, but at the same time,
Really?
aspects of aspects of it that we can look at that I personally enjoyed. The aesthetics. There were aesthetics in the film, and certain shots looked very beautiful. And Craig put out a great performance. Um, I have
Yeah.
to give it like a C minus.
That is a lot higher than I thought you'd give it.
Yeah, I don't want to be too critical, just because there's a lot of elements that I think there are a lot of elements that I think objectively can you really like sometimes it was out of the hands of the film in itself just because of bad writing, bad no not a great script,
Yeah.
director having like very like different vision for what we expect of Bond. But having said that, I have respect for films that try to subvert expectation.
Um, that's a higher rating than I thought you would give it. I would so I'm right there with you actually. I think so I own the I guess the 60th anniversary Blu-ray collection, the first 25 movies I think. And this movie's interesting. They would never publicly say it, but you can tell Eon was not very happy with this movie at all because all of the other Blu-rays that I have in the collection
Mm-hmm.
are loaded with special features and most notably directors and producers and crew members commentary, right? Roger Moore provides commentary for all of his movies. So every other Bond movie in the collection has at least one commentary track and is loaded with special features. Quantum of Solace, nothing, bare bones. There's nothing.
That's that's
It's just
sad.
it's basically the movie and subtitles and that's it. So you
And
can really tell they weren't happy with this movie.
I would have, and honestly, I would have loved. I think that is part of the fun is going behind the scenes and saying what didn't go right.
Yeah.
but yeah.
My opinion of this movie, I we really took this movie to task with the plot and how like shitty the action is. Still though, I really have a soft spot for all Bond movies, and I think that this movie, because of the writer's strike, was really a victim of unfortunate circumstances rather than
Mhm.
design. Yes, I think Forster was the wrong choice. Yes, he made poor decisions when it came to the acting, but I my heart goes out to him in a way because I really think he did the best he could given I can only imagine how difficult it is to direct this kind of movie with this big of a budget and this big expectations when they tell you right from the get-go, "Oh, and by the way, we don't have a completed script." I
Got it.
really think he did the best job he could, and I do kind of want to cut him a break for that. I like Daniel Craig a lot in this movie. I like Olga Kurylenko. It's definitely not one of my favorite Bond movies. I have it probably in the bottom five, but I'm still going to give it a C minus. And if
Fair.
you were like, "Hey Pat, let's watch a Bond movie. Do you mind if I put on Quantum of Solace right now?" I'd be like, "Cool, let's do it."
Yeah.
I would watch it. You know, like we mentioned this in the intro, there are plenty of people that like this movie, and they will tell you, the defenders of this movie will tell you that it works best when you watch it back to back with Casino Royale and you essentially treat it as one long movie. And I don't do that because it ends up being a very long movie with a very where the first 2.5 hours are much better than the last hour and 40 minutes, whatever.
Right.
It's not like watching Back to the Future 2 or 3 or Kill Bill for me. It, I mean, you kind of alluded to it before that it's you can appreciate what they were trying to do. I would call this movie a swing and a miss, but I will always appreciate a swing. It's still a Bond movie. I love Bond movies enough that I will appreciate how much of an outlier it is. And yes, C minus, just like you.
We're on the same page. So, buddy, next time we next time we meet up, let's put on Quantum of Solace.
If that's what you want, we can do that.
Okay.
I didn't think that would be your first choice, but so we're yeah. So that's it for this edition of Why Wasn't It Better. So we're at the point now where we're recording these out of order, and technically the next movie that we select. Would you like to talk about The Matrix Reloaded?
Uh, Gladly. Let's plug it in.
Excellent.
Let's plug it into the Matrix.
Let's plug it in. Um, so we will be back with another edition. Better. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Take care, folks.